Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in the remote hollows of West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1899 brought an unusual quiet to the mountains of Pocahontas County, West Virginia. Even for a region accustomed to isolation and the peculiar rhythms of mountain life, there was something unsettling about the silence that had settled over Rigsby Hollow. The name itself had become a whisper among the scattered families who called these remote ridges home, spoken only when necessary and never after dark. Silas Rigsby had lived in those mountains for nearly 40 years. Arriving as a young man in 1860 with his bride Cordelia, seeking the kind of solitude that only the deepest Appalachian wilderness could provide. Their cabin, built into a natural depression between two steep ridges, was accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense stands of hemlock and rhododendron. Even the most experienced mountain folk considered it a journey of considerable difficulty, requiring nearly half a day's travel from the nearest settlement. The terrain leading to Rigsby Hollow was treacherous under the best conditions. The path, barely wide enough for a single traveler, carved its way through sections of loose shale that could shift without warning underfoot. Ancient hemlocks, some measuring 12 feet in circumference, created a canopy so dense that, even on bright days, the trail remained shrouded in perpetual twilight. During winter months, ice formed on the exposed rock faces, making passage nearly impossible for anyone unfamiliar with the specific handholds and footings that Silas had marked over decades of travel. The hollow itself occupied approximately 200 acres of relatively flat land, surrounded on all sides by ridges that rose steeply to heights of nearly 800 feet above the cabin site. This natural amphitheater provided complete privacy and protection from mountain storms, but it also created an environment of profound acoustic isolation. Sounds from the outside world rarely penetrated the hollow, while conversations or activities within it seemed amplified and distorted by the surrounding rock formations. For decades, the Rigsbys had maintained a tenuous connection with the outside world through monthly visits to Hackett's General Store, a modest establishment that served as the unofficial hub of communication for the scattered mountain community. The store occupied a weathered frame building at the confluence of two mountain streams, positioned strategically where several trails converged. Tobias Crenshaw had operated the business since 1876, serving families scattered across nearly 300 square miles of some of West Virginia's most challenging terrain. Silas would arrive with whatever pelts or carved goods he had to trade, exchange minimal pleasantries with the storekeeper, and disappear back into the wilderness with supplies that would sustain him and Cordelia until the next visit. The arrangement had worked seamlessly for nearly 4 decades. Crenshaw's ledger, discovered years later among his papers, documents the regularity of these transactions with mechanical precision. S. Rigsby, 3 beaver pelts, 12 lbs. Flour, 4 lbs. Salt, 1 Leluelbu coffee, 2 lbs. Sugar, 1 bottle patent medicine. The entries follow an identical pattern month after month, year after year, until October of 1899, when the pattern abruptly ceased. Crenshaw's notations reveal a man of methodical habits who recorded not just transactions, but also brief observations about his customers' demeanor and health. Earlier entries about Silas describe him as steady disposition, good health, pays in full. However, the final few entries from the summer of 1899 show subtle changes in these personal observations. S.R. appeared tired, asked unusual questions about strangers in area, and S.R. seemed agitated, kept looking over shoulder during transaction. The first sign that something had changed came not from Silas himself, but from Ezekiel Harrow, a hunter who had established his own homestead on the opposite ridge from Rigsby Hollow. Harrow's property, while also isolated, maintained better access to the main valley settlements through a more established trail system. He had lived in the mountains for 15 years, supporting his family through hunting, trapping, and occasional work as a guide for traveling merchants or government surveyors. Harrow later described to county officials an incident that occurred in early September of that year. While tracking a wounded deer through the dense undergrowth, he had inadvertently approached closer to the Rigsby property than ever before. The natural boundaries between mountain homesteads were typically respected without formal surveying, based on watershed lines, ridge crests, and traditional usage patterns. Harrow's pursuit of the injured animal had taken him across these informal boundaries into territory he had never previously explored. What he observed from his concealed position among the laurel bushes troubled him deeply. Silas was standing motionless in the small clearing beside his cabin, staring intently at the tree line. Harrow initially assumed the man was simply watching for game or checking his trap lines. However, as minutes passed, Silas remained completely still, his gaze fixed on a specific point among the trees. The hunter waited, curious about what might have captured such intense attention. After nearly an hour, Silas finally moved, but instead of heading toward the trees, he walked backward toward his cabin, never taking his eyes off that same spot among the hemlocks. The behavior struck Harrow as profoundly unnatural. Mountain people were cautious by necessity, always alert to their surroundings. But this was something different. There was a quality of fear in Silas's posture that seemed disproportionate to any ordinary concern about wildlife or weather. The wounded deer, meanwhile, had continued deeper into the forest, leaving a blood trail that Harrow could have followed easily. However, the strange scene he had witnessed drove all thoughts of hunting from his mind. He retreated quietly, but the image remained fixed in his memory, a grown man backing away from something that existed only in his own perception. 3 weeks later, Harrow encountered Silas on the main trail that connected their respective properties to the settlement. The meeting occurred at a natural widening of the path where travelers typically paused to exchange news or simply acknowledge each other's presence. These chance encounters were important social events in the isolated mountain communities, providing rare opportunities for sharing information about weather patterns, wildlife movements, and potential dangers. Harrow greeted his neighbor with the customary mountain courtesy, asking about Cordelia's health and commenting on the unusually dry conditions that had characterized the early autumn. Instead of returning the greeting, Silas demanded to know if Harrow had seen them moving through the trees. His voice carried an urgency that suggested the question was not casual conversation, but a matter of immediate concern. When Harrow asked for clarification, Silas became increasingly agitated, insisting that they had been watching his cabin for weeks, moving through the forest in coordinated patterns, always staying just out of direct sight. He described hearing organized footsteps circling his property during the night, the sound of branches being deliberately arranged as markers, and the unmistakable sense of being studied by numerous observers who remained hidden among the dense vegetation. The level of detail in Silas's descriptions was both impressive and disturbing. He had apparently spent considerable time analyzing what he believed to be surveillance activities, developing theories about the number of individuals involved, their movement patterns, and their apparent objectives. He spoke of shifts during which different groups of watchers replaced each other, maintaining constant observation while rotating responsibilities. He described specific locations where he had found evidence of concealed observation posts, flattened areas behind large boulders, modified tree branches that created sight lines toward his cabin, and arrangements of stones that seemed too regular to be natural. Harrow attempted to suggest practical explanations. Bears preparing for winter hibernation, seasonal migration patterns of deer, or even the possibility of Cherokee hunting parties passing through the region. The Cherokee had maintained traditional hunting rights in certain sections of the mountains through treaty agreements, and their presence, while uncommon, was not unknown. However, Silas dismissed each suggestion with increasing irritation, maintaining that he knew the sounds of ordinary forest activity and what he was experiencing was entirely different. His expertise in wilderness survival was indisputable. 40 years of mountain life had given him an almost supernatural ability to interpret natural sounds and signs. He could identify individual animal species by their footprints in soft earth, predict weather changes hours in advance based on subtle shifts in atmospheric pressure, and navigate through the densest forest conditions without compass or marked trails. This knowledge made his current claims even more troubling because they came from someone whose observational skills had been proven reliable over decades. Before ending the conversation abruptly, Silas made a statement that Harrow would remember for the rest of his life. "They're not animals, Ezekiel. They're something that learned to walk upright but never learned to be human." The phrasing was deliberately chosen, suggesting not a momentary delusion, but a carefully considered assessment based on accumulated observations. The October visit to Hackett's General Store never occurred. When November passed without any sign of Silas, Crenshaw began to express concern to other customers. The storekeeper was a practical man who understood the rhythms of mountain life, the way winter weather could delay travel or force changes in established routines. He had operated his business through 23 consecutive winters, learning to anticipate the needs of families who might be cut off from outside contact for months at a time. However, Silas had never missed 2 consecutive monthly visits, not even during the severe winter of 1887, when snow had blocked the mountain passes for weeks. During that particularly harsh season, he had arrived at the store on snowshoes, having traveled for 3 days through conditions that other mountain families considered impassable. His dedication to maintaining contact with the outside world was legendary among the scattered mountain communities, making his current absence all the more significant. Crenshaw's concerns were shared by Dr. Mordecai Thorne, the only medical practitioner serving the mountain communities within a 50-mile radius. Dr. Thorne had established his practice in 1885 after completing medical training in Charleston, drawn to the mountains by a combination of professional challenge and personal preference for frontier life. His clientele consisted of approximately 200 families scattered across terrain so difficult that house calls often required multi-day journeys on horseback. The doctor had treated both Silas and Cordelia on several occasions over the years, primarily for injuries related to their challenging lifestyle and occasional seasonal illnesses. His medical records, maintained with careful attention to detail, documented 2 important facts about the Rigsby family. Both had enjoyed remarkably good health throughout their 4 decades of mountain life, and both had demonstrated exceptional mental stability and emotional balance during previous medical consultations. As December arrived with still no word from Rigsby Hollow, a small group of men organized an expedition to check on the welfare of Silas and Cordelia. The group included Harrow, Crenshaw, Dr. Thorne, Deputy Marshal Jeremiah Skaggs, and a tracker named Judah Whitmore, who knew the mountain trails better than any other living person. Deputy Marshal Skaggs represented law enforcement for a territory covering nearly 800 square miles of mountain wilderness. His appointment to the position had come through political connections rather than law enforcement experience. But 15 years of dealing with mountain communities had taught him the delicate balance required to maintain order in regions where federal authority was largely theoretical. Most of his work involved settling property disputes, investigating occasional thefts, and providing official documentation for deaths, births, and other events that required government recognition. Judah Whitmore's inclusion in the expedition was essential because of his unmatched knowledge of mountain geography. Born and raised in the region, he had spent his entire adult life working as a guide for government surveyors, timber companies, and occasional hunting parties. His mental map of the mountain trail systems was so detailed and accurate that he could navigate to specific locations even in complete darkness, using only subtle changes in terrain and vegetation to maintain his bearings. The journey to Rigsby Hollow in early December proved more difficult than expected. Recent storms had created new obstacles along the trail, fallen trees that blocked traditional pathways, sections of loose rock where frost had fractured stone faces, and accumulated ice in shaded areas that made footing treacherous. The expedition required nearly 8 hours to cover a distance that Silas typically traveled in 4 hours, even when carrying heavy loads of supplies. The narrow trail showed clear signs of recent use, but not in the organized pattern typical of normal foot traffic. Instead, the ground displayed evidence of frantic, repetitive movement, areas where the earth had been worn down by pacing, circular patterns where someone had walked in tight loops, and strange markings that appeared to be deliberately created symbols scratched into the bark of trees. Dr. Thorne, who had received medical training in Charleston before establishing his practice in the mountains, documented these observations in a detailed report that would later become crucial evidence in understanding what had transpired. His description of the trail conditions suggests a systematic deterioration of normal behavior. The path shows evidence of obsessive travel patterns. Someone has walked the same sections repeatedly, wearing grooves into the earth that speak of compulsive movement rather than purposeful travel. Arta. The most disturbing discovery along the trail was a series of what appeared to be deliberate modifications to the natural environment. Trees had been marked with carved symbols that resembled crude maps or directional indicators. Rocks had been stacked in cairn-like formations that seemed to serve as markers or reference points. Most unsettling were sections where branches had been woven together to create primitive barriers across side trails that led away from the main path. These modifications required considerable time and effort to create. Someone had spent hours, perhaps days, systematically altering the natural landscape to serve purposes that were not immediately apparent to the rescue expedition. The work showed signs of careful planning and execution, suggesting organized thought processes rather than random vandalism or mental deterioration. The cabin itself appeared structurally sound from a distance, but as the group approached, disturbing details became apparent. Every window had been boarded shut from the inside, with gaps between the boards allowing only narrow slices of light to penetrate the interior. The boards themselves were not simply nailed in place, but had been secured with an elaborate system of ropes, wires, and wooden braces that would have taken considerable time to install and would be extremely difficult to remove quickly. The door remained closed but was unmarked by any obvious barrier. However, close examination revealed that it had been reinforced with additional wooden planks attached to the interior surface. The reinforcement was visible through gaps around the door frame, indicating that whoever had made these modifications was extremely concerned about preventing forced entry from outside. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney, indicating recent occupation. The smoke was clean and white, suggesting properly seasoned wood was being burned rather than green wood or materials that might indicate emergency conditions. This detail was significant because it demonstrated that whoever was inside the cabin retained the knowledge and capability to maintain normal heating systems. The clearing around the cabin showed signs of systematic modification similar to what the expedition had observed along the trail. The natural vegetation had been altered to create clear sight lines in all directions, while maintaining enough cover to conceal observers positioned around the building's perimeter. Small shelters constructed from branches and natural materials had been built at strategic locations, each positioned to provide observation of specific approaches to the cabin. Crenshaw called out the traditional mountain greeting, identifying himself and requesting permission to approach. The response came not from inside the cabin, but from somewhere among the surrounding trees. Silas's voice, clearly recognizable, but strained and hollow, demanding that the visitors identify themselves more specifically and explain the purpose of their visit. When they complied, explaining their concern about his missed visits to the store and their desire to check on his and Cordelia's welfare, Silas emerged from a carefully concealed position behind a massive oak tree, approximately 50 yards from his own front door. The position had been prepared with obvious care. Natural materials had been arranged to create effective camouflage, and the sight lines allowed observation of all approaches to the cabin while remaining invisible to casual observers. The physical transformation was immediately apparent. Silas had always been a lean man, conditioned by decades of mountain life, but he now appeared gaunt to the point of malnutrition. His clothes hung loosely on a frame that seemed to have lost substantial weight over a very short period. His hair, typically neat and well-maintained, had grown long and unkempt. Most disturbing was the condition of his hands, which showed cuts and abrasions consistent with extensive manual labor performed without proper tools or protection. More troubling was his behavior. He refused to step into the clearing around his cabin, insisting on conducting the entire conversation from his position among the trees. His eyes moved constantly, scanning the surrounding forest as if expecting threats to emerge at any moment. He spoke in whispers, frequently pausing to listen for sounds that others could not detect, and repeatedly asked whether the visitors had been followed or had noticed anyone observing their journey to the hollow. When asked about Cordelia, Silas's demeanor shifted dramatically. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he explained that she was sleeping more deeply now and could not be disturbed. The phrasing was ambiguous enough to suggest either illness or something more permanent, but Silas refused to elaborate, despite persistent questioning from Dr. Thorne. Dr. Thorne requested permission to check on her medical condition, explaining that he had brought medical supplies and could provide treatment for any illness she might be experiencing. However, Silas became agitated, insisting that no one could approach the cabin because they were watching and waiting for exactly such an opportunity. He claimed that the arrival of the rescue party had already attracted unwanted attention, and that any attempt to enter the cabin would trigger coordinated action from the observers he believed were positioned throughout the surrounding forest. Deputy Marshal Skaggs attempted to establish some factual foundation for Silas's concerns, asking direct questions about who might be threatening him, when the surveillance had begun, and whether any specific incidents had triggered his fears. The responses revealed a mind that had constructed an elaborate framework of persecution based on observations that others could not verify. Silas described a group of individuals who moved through the forest with unnatural coordination, who communicated through systems of branch arrangements and stone patterns, and who had been conducting surveillance of his property for months. The level of detail in his descriptions was both impressive and disturbing. He had developed elaborate theories about their organizational structure, their apparent objectives, and the sophisticated techniques they employed to avoid detection. According to his account, the surveillance had begun in late spring, initially consisting of occasional observations of single individuals moving through the forest at considerable distances from his property. Over the summer months, the activity had intensified, with multiple observers maintaining coordinated watches and establishing what appeared to be permanent observation posts in the surrounding ridges. The details were precise and internally consistent, delivered with the conviction of someone reporting factual observations rather than delusions. Silas described specific individuals whom he had observed repeatedly, noting distinctive characteristics of their movement patterns and apparent specialized roles within their organization. He claimed to have documented their shift changes, identified their communication methods, and analyzed their apparent interest in his property and activities. However, when pressed for physical evidence of these intruders, Silas could offer only the arranged branches and stones that the rescue party had already observed. These phenomena could easily be explained by natural processes: storms that knock down tree limbs, seasonal animal activity, or the simple effects of erosion and seasonal change on the mountain landscape. As the conversation continued, it became clear that Silas had not been maintaining normal patterns of daily life for some time. He admitted to sleeping during daylight hours and remaining awake throughout the night to watch for signs of movement around his property. His hunting and trapping activities had ceased entirely because leaving the immediate vicinity of his cabin would provide opportunities for them to establish positions closer to the building. This change in daily routine was particularly significant because hunting and trapping had been essential elements of the Rigsby family's survival strategy for 4 decades. Silas possessed exceptional skills as a woodsman and had consistently provided meat and fur that sustained them through long mountain winters. His willingness to abandon these activities suggested either complete irrationality or genuine terror of consequences he believed would result from normal movement around his property. The group attempted to persuade Silas to accompany them back to the settlement, at least temporarily, while the situation could be properly investigated. They offered practical solutions: temporary housing with other mountain families, medical evaluation for both him and Cordelia, and official investigation of his claims about surveillance activities. However, he refused categorically, insisting that leaving would allow them to take possession of his property, and that Cordelia could not be moved in her current condition. When Dr. Thorne pressed for more specific information about Cordelia's health, asking direct medical questions about symptoms, duration of illness, and possible causes, Silas's responses became increasingly evasive. He claimed that her condition was beyond medical treatment and that disturbing her rest would be harmful to everyone involved. The vague nature of these statements, combined with his refusal to allow medical examination, raised serious concerns about her actual status. The doctor attempted to approach the cabin independently, explaining that his medical responsibilities required him to verify the welfare of any person reported to be ill or injured. However, Silas became extremely agitated, positioning himself between Dr. Thorne and the cabin while insisting that any approach would trigger immediate response from the hidden observers. His behavior suggested genuine terror rather than simple obstinacy, indicating that he truly believed the consequences of allowing visitors near his cabin would be catastrophic. After nearly 2 hours of conversation, the rescue party realized that Silas would not voluntarily leave his property and would not permit them to enter his cabin. His mental state appeared to have deteriorated to the point where rational persuasion was impossible, but he showed no signs of immediate physical danger that would justify forced intervention. Deputy Marshal Skaggs made the difficult decision to respect Silas's rights as a property owner while documenting the situation for potential future intervention. The legal framework for dealing with mental illness in frontier communities was extremely limited, requiring clear evidence of immediate danger to self or others before authorities could override individual rights. Despite obvious concerns about Silas's mental condition, his behavior did not meet the legal threshold for involuntary commitment or removal from his property. The group departed with plans to return in 2 weeks to check on the situation again. Dr. Thorne left medical supplies in a location where Silas could retrieve them safely, along with written instructions for treating common winter ailments. Deputy Marshal Skaggs documented the encounter in his official log, creating a legal record that could be referenced if more serious intervention became necessary. However, the promised return visit never occurred. 4 days after the initial expedition, the region experienced one of the most severe early winter storms in recorded memory. Snow fell continuously for 6 days, accumulating to depths that made travel through the mountain passes impossible even for experienced mountaineers. Temperature dropped to levels that had not been recorded in the area since the establishment of weather monitoring stations. The storm was followed by a period of extreme cold that lasted nearly 3 weeks, with daytime temperatures remaining below freezing and nighttime conditions reaching levels that threatened survival, even for people with adequate shelter and supplies. The combination of deep snow and bitter cold created conditions where travel to remote locations like Rigsby Hollow was simply impossible, regardless of motivation or equipment. By the time the weather cleared sufficiently for travel, nearly 3 weeks had passed since the rescue expedition had departed from Silas's property. Concern about his and Cordelia's survival during such extreme conditions motivated immediate organization of a second expedition, this time equipped with winter survival gear and emergency medical supplies. When Harrow finally managed to reach Rigsby Hollow in early January of 1900, he found the cabin standing open to the elements. The door hung on its hinges, moving slightly in the mountain wind. Snow had drifted through the opening, covering much of the interior floor with a layer of ice and accumulated debris. There was no sign of recent habitation, no indication that anyone had been present since the storm began. The condition of the cabin's exterior showed clear evidence of the severe weather it had endured. Several of the window boards had been torn loose by wind, leaving gaps that allowed snow to accumulate inside the building. The chimney showed no signs of recent use, and the wood supply that had been stacked beside the cabin remained untouched, suggesting that no one had been maintaining heating systems during the brutal cold period. The interior of the cabin revealed evidence of a rapid departure or abandonment. Personal belongings remained scattered throughout the single room. Clothes, tools, cooking implements, and books lay exactly where they had been dropped or hastily packed. However, several items that mountain families typically considered essential were missing. No firearms could be found, nor any of the basic survival equipment that would be necessary for travel through winter mountains. More puzzling was the condition of the cabin's interior modifications. The boards that had covered the windows from inside remained in place where wind had not torn them loose, but they had been arranged in increasingly elaborate patterns. What had initially appeared to be simple protective barriers revealed themselves as complex constructions involving multiple layers of wood, rope, and fabric. The effect was to create a maze-like interior where movement through the single room required careful navigation around the various barriers and obstacles. The modifications showed clear evidence of progressive development over time, with earlier, simpler constructions being modified and expanded into increasingly complex systems. Someone had spent considerable time and effort transforming a simple cabin interior into something resembling a fortified position designed to provide protection from multiple directions simultaneously. Dr. Thorne, who participated in this second expedition, documented his observations with scientific precision. The interior modifications suggest systematic paranoia that escalated over time. The window coverings became increasingly elaborate, but they also made the living space progressively less functional for normal domestic activities. Someone created a fortress mentality that ultimately made the space uninhabitable for practical purposes. Behind the cabin, Harrow discovered evidence that supported Silas's claims about nocturnal surveillance activities. The ground showed clear patterns of repeated pacing in precise geometric shapes. Circles approximately 10 feet in diameter had been worn into the earth by countless repetitions of the same walking pattern. Lines connected these circles, creating a complex diagram that covered nearly an acre of cleared ground behind the building. The patterns were too regular and deliberate to be explained by random activity. Someone had spent considerable time walking these specific routes, wearing paths into the ground that represented hours of obsessive movement. The depth of the worn paths suggested that this activity had continued for weeks or months. with the same routes being walked repeatedly until they became permanent features of the landscape. However, the patterns also revealed something more disturbing. They had been designed to provide sight lines to every possible approach to the cabin while remaining concealed from observation by anyone approaching along the normal trail. The walking routes created an integrated system of observation posts that would allow a single person to monitor the entire perimeter of the property while maintaining mobility and concealment. The sophistication of this system suggested careful planning and considerable knowledge of surveillance principles. Someone had analyzed the terrain, identified potential approach routes, and created a patrol system that maximized coverage while minimizing exposure. This level of tactical thinking was inconsistent with random paranoid behavior and suggested that whoever had created the system possessed genuine expertise in security procedures. In the cabin's single storage area, searchers found a collection of notebooks that Silas had apparently been maintaining throughout the period of his increasing isolation. The notebooks were stored in a waterproof container that had protected them from the weather damage that had affected other items in the cabin. The careful preservation of these documents suggested that Silas considered them extremely important, possibly as evidence of the threats he believed he was facing. The handwriting in the earliest entries was neat and methodical, documenting normal mountain activities, weather patterns, game observations, seasonal changes in vegetation, and routine maintenance tasks around the property. The entries from early 1899 showed a man maintaining systematic records of his environment and activities, consistent with the organized approach to mountain life that had sustained him for decades. However, as the entries progressed through the summer and autumn of 1899, both the content and the physical characteristics of the writing changed dramatically. The later entries focused exclusively on surveillance activities that Silas believed he was observing around his property. He had developed elaborate systems for tracking movement patterns, documenting times and locations where he observed anomalous activity. The level of detail in these surveillance logs was extraordinary. Silas recorded specific times when he observed movement in the forest, detailed descriptions of the individuals he believed he was seeing, and complex analyses of their apparent organizational structure and objectives. He documented what he interpreted as shift changes among observers, identified what he believed were communication methods between different groups, and analyzed patterns of activity that suggested coordinated operations. The handwriting became increasingly erratic, with words heavily underlined or traced multiple times for emphasis. Some pages contained diagrams and sketches that appeared to represent tactical positions and movement patterns. The diagram showed sophisticated understanding of terrain features and sight lines, suggesting that whoever had created them possessed genuine knowledge of military or security procedures. One entry, dated in mid-November, consisted entirely of a single sentence repeated 47 times. "They know that I know that they know." The obsessive repetition filled an entire page, with each iteration written slightly larger than the previous one, until the final repetition covered nearly half the page in letters that seemed carved into the paper rather than simply written. Dr. Thorne's analysis of the notebooks revealed a progressive deterioration of rational thought processes, but not in the chaotic pattern typical of most mental disturbances. Instead, the entries showed a systematic development of paranoid beliefs that maintained internal logical consistency even as they departed from observable reality. This suggested a mind that remained intellectually capable, but had become trapped within a framework of false assumptions that distorted all subsequent perceptions. The final entry in the notebooks was dated December 8th, the day before the severe weather began. It consisted of a detailed plan for permanent relocation to secure position. The plan described specific routes through the mountains that would avoid compromised areas and reach safe territory beyond the reach of surveillance operations. The level of detail in this evacuation plan was remarkable. Silas had calculated distances between potential shelter locations, identified water sources and food caches, and planned alternative routes in case primary paths became blocked or compromised. The plan showed sophisticated understanding of winter survival techniques and demonstrated that despite his deteriorating mental condition, he retained practical knowledge that could sustain him in wilderness conditions. However, there was no mention of Cordelia in this final planning document. Throughout the earlier entries, references to her had become increasingly rare and ambiguous. The last clear mention occurred in early October, when Silas noted that she was resting more comfortably now and no longer troubled by the sounds from outside. Subsequent references used only pronouns or oblique phrases that made it impossible to determine her actual condition or whereabouts. Entries mentioned watching over her and protecting her rest, but provided no specific details about her health, activities, or involvement in the security measures that were consuming Silas's attention. The search party expanded their investigation to include the immediate vicinity around the cabin, looking for any signs of what had happened to Cordelia or clues about Silas's departure route. What they discovered raised more questions than it answered. Behind the cabin, in an area that had been used as a root cellar, they found evidence of recent excavation. A section of earth approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide had been dug and then carefully refilled. The soil showed clear signs of disturbance, but the work had been completed with enough care to suggest deliberate concealment rather than hasty burial. The excavated area was located in a position that would not be visible from the main approaches to the cabin, indicating that whoever had done the digging was concerned about concealing the activity from potential observers. Deputy Marshal Skaggs made the decision to investigate this excavation site more thoroughly. The legal implications of disturbing what might be a burial site were significant, but the circumstances of the case and the disappearance of 2 individuals justified more detailed investigation. What they found beneath 3 feet of carefully replaced earth was a wooden box, roughly the size that might be used for storing documents or personal valuables. Inside the box were items that seemed to represent Cordelia's most treasured possessions. A wedding photograph showing a young couple posed formally in front of a photographer's backdrop, several pieces of jewelry including a cameo brooch and pearl earrings, letters tied with ribbon that appeared to be correspondence from relatives, and a small leather-bound Bible with numerous marked passages. The condition of these items was troubling. Everything showed signs of having been carefully cleaned and arranged, as if prepared for long-term storage or preservation. The photograph had been wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture, and the jewelry had been polished until it gleamed. This suggested someone taking considerable care to preserve meaningful objects, but the location of the burial implied that these items had been removed from normal use permanently. More disturbing was a note found wrapped around the Bible. In Silas's handwriting, it read, "She understood before the end that staying was impossible. These things should remain where she was happiest. The watchers cannot touch what lies beneath the earth." The note was dated November 15th, approximately 2 weeks after the rescue party's first visit to the cabin. Dr. Thorne's interpretation of this evidence was grimly clinical. In his formal report, submitted to the county authorities in February of 1900, he wrote, "The evidence suggests that Mrs. Rigsby deceased sometime between early October and mid-November of 1899. The careful burial of personal effects indicates ritualistic behavior consistent with prolonged grief response complicated by paranoid ideation. However, the absence of human remains at the site raises questions about disposition of the deceased that cannot be answered through available evidence." The note's reference to watchers being unable to touch what lies beneath the earth suggested that Silas believed even in death, Cordelia needed protection from the forces he perceived as threatening them. The careful preservation of her belongings indicated a desire to maintain some connection with her memory while ensuring that the objects she valued would remain safe from whatever dangers he believed they faced. The official investigation concluded that Silas Rigsby had departed his mountain property sometime around December 8, 1899, traveling on foot through winter conditions that made survival unlikely. His motivation appeared to be advanced paranoid delusions that had convinced him he was under surveillance by hostile forces. The fate of Cordelia Rigsby remained officially undetermined, with her death presumed but unconfirmed, due to the absence of physical evidence. However, the story of Silas Rigsby did not end with the official closure of the investigation. Over the following months, reports began to circulate among the mountain communities of encounters with a figure who matched Silas's physical description. These sightings followed a pattern that suggested systematic movement through the remote areas of 3 different counties, always in locations far from established settlements or regular travel routes. The first documented encounter occurred in February of 1900, when a group of loggers working in a remote section of Greenbrier County reported meeting a man who claimed to be traveling to safer territory. The logging operation was harvesting timber from old-growth forests in an area so remote that the crew lived in temporary camps rather than traveling to and from settlements each day. The man matched Silas's physical description and displayed the same paranoid behavior patterns that had been observed during the December rescue attempt. He insisted on conducting the entire conversation from a concealed position among the trees and repeatedly asked whether the loggers had noticed anyone following the ridge lines or observed coordinated movements in the forest. When the loggers offered assistance, including food and directions to the nearest settlement, the man declined, explaining that accepting help would reveal my position to them. He did, however, provide information that confirmed his identity as Silas Rigsby. He mentioned specific details about his former property, asked about weather conditions in Pocahontas County, and inquired whether anyone had been asking questions about him. Before departing, Silas requested that the loggers inform anyone who inquired that he was continuing toward the secure zone, and that he had successfully avoided compromise during the relocation. The language suggested military or intelligence terminology, indicating that his paranoid framework had evolved to incorporate more sophisticated concepts of operational security. Similar encounters were reported throughout the spring and summer of 1900, creating a trail that suggested Silas was moving systematically through the most remote sections of the Appalachian wilderness. Each encounter followed the same pattern: brief contact with isolated individuals, paranoid questioning about potential surveillance, and immediate departure toward even more isolated areas. The reports came from diverse sources: timber crews, railroad survey teams, Cherokee hunters, and occasional government officials conducting business in remote areas. The consistency of these accounts across different counties and different types of witnesses suggested that Silas was indeed surviving in the wilderness and maintaining his pattern of avoiding populated areas while seeking information about potential threats. The psychological profile that emerged from these encounters was both tragic and deeply disturbing. Silas appeared to be maintaining his physical health and survival skills while remaining trapped within the same paranoid framework that had driven him from his home. He had successfully adapted to life as a wilderness nomad, but his mental condition showed no signs of improvement. If anything, the isolation seemed to be reinforcing his delusions rather than providing the relief he sought. Dr. Thorne, who continued to follow the case despite its official closure, theorized that Silas had entered a psychological state where his survival depended on maintaining the same beliefs that had destroyed his previous life. Mr. Rigsby appears to have created a self-sustaining system of paranoid thought that provides both motivation for continued survival and justification for complete social isolation. The beliefs that drove him from society now serve as the foundation for his existence outside society. The medical literature of the period offered limited understanding of the psychological mechanisms involved in such cases. Dr. Thorne's analysis drew on emerging theories about mental illness, but the frontier environment provided few resources for treatment or systematic study of psychiatric conditions. His documentation of the Rigsby case became one of the few detailed records of how severe mental illness could manifest in isolated rural populations. The last confirmed sighting of Silas Rigsby occurred in August of 1900 when a Cherokee hunter encountered him in a remote section of the Monongahela forest. The hunter, whose name was recorded as Joseph Crow Feather, provided his account to Indian agent Morrison Clark, who maintained official records of interactions between Cherokee individuals and other residents of the region. The hunter described a man living in carefully constructed temporary shelters that could be quickly abandoned when necessary. Silas had developed sophisticated techniques for concealing his presence and monitoring the surrounding area for signs of pursuit. His shelters were built using advanced wilderness survival methods that demonstrated expert knowledge of forest conditions and weather patterns. The hunter observed Silas from concealment for several hours before making contact, noting that the man maintained constant vigilance about his surroundings and followed elaborate security procedures even for routine activities like collecting water or gathering firewood. Every action was planned to minimize exposure and maintain awareness of potential threats from multiple directions. However, the hunter also noted signs that Silas's mental condition was continuing to deteriorate. His speech had become increasingly disjointed, with frequent references to messages being sent through arrangements of natural objects and coordinated movements by wildlife that allegedly indicated human surveillance. He claimed to be receiving intelligence about enemy activities through systems that existed only in his imagination. The hunter concluded that Silas was no longer capable of distinguishing between genuine threats and the products of his own troubled mind. His survival skills remained intact, but his perception of reality had become so distorted that every natural phenomenon was interpreted as evidence of organized opposition to his existence. After August of 1900, the trail of Silas Rigsby disappears entirely from documented history. Whether he died in the wilderness, moved beyond the region where encounters might be reported, or simply became too skilled at avoiding human contact to be observed, remains unknown. The case file was officially closed in December of 1900, exactly 1 year after his disappearance from Rigsby Hollow. In 1952, during a comprehensive survey of mountain properties conducted by the West Virginia Department of Natural Resources, surveyors rediscovered the Rigsby cabin site. The structure had collapsed during the intervening decades, but the geometric patterns behind the building remained clearly visible. Vegetation had grown over the worn paths, but the underlying patterns were still apparent to observers who knew what to look for. More significantly, the survey team discovered additional notebooks that had been buried in a waterproof container near the tree line. These notebooks, apparently hidden by Silas during his final days at the property, contained detailed observations about the surveillance patterns he believed he had identified. The entries were accompanied by elaborate maps showing positions of supposed observers, timing charts for their activities, and tactical analyses of their apparent objectives. The notebooks revealed that Silas had convinced himself he was dealing with an organized group of individuals who possessed sophisticated knowledge of wilderness survival and surveillance techniques. His descriptions of their activities showed remarkable consistency and attention to detail, despite the fact that no physical evidence of such individuals was ever discovered. The maps included in these final notebooks were particularly sophisticated, showing detailed topographical knowledge of the surrounding mountain region and identifying specific locations that he believed were being used as observation posts or communication centers. The level of geographical accuracy suggested that Silas had maintained his expertise in mountain navigation despite his deteriorating mental condition. Dr. Helena Vance, a psychiatrist from West Virginia University who studied the recovered notebooks in 1963, published the only comprehensive analysis of the Rigsby case in medical literature. Her conclusion was that Silas had suffered from what would now be recognized as paranoid schizophrenia, with symptoms that developed gradually over several years before reaching the acute phase observed in 1899. However, Dr. Vance also noted aspects of the case that didn't fit standard diagnostic patterns. The level of functional capability that Silas maintained, even while experiencing severe delusions, was unusual. His ability to survive in wilderness conditions while mentally ill demonstrated cognitive abilities that typically deteriorate more rapidly in similar cases. This suggested either an atypical presentation of the disease or complicating factors that weren't documented in the available evidence. The mystery of Cordelia's fate was never officially resolved. Dr. Vance's analysis suggested that she probably died from natural causes, possibly during an illness that Silas was unable to understand or treat effectively. His paranoid state would have made it impossible for him to seek medical assistance, and the isolation of their mountain property meant that help was not readily available in any case. The careful burial of her personal effects, combined with the absence of human remains at the site, suggested that Silas had disposed of her body in a location that he considered more secure or appropriate. The mountains contained numerous caves, crevices, and remote locations where a body might never be discovered. Silas's final notes about Cordelia being where she was happiest could indicate that he chose a burial site based on emotional significance rather than convenience. The broader implications of the Rigsby case extended beyond the tragedy of two individual lives. Dr. Vance's study contributed to early understanding of how mental illness could manifest in isolated rural populations, where access to medical care was limited and social support systems were often insufficient to recognize developing problems. The case became a reference point for discussions about the unique challenges faced by frontier communities in dealing with psychological disorders. Furthermore, the case illustrated how environmental factors could either trigger or exacerbate mental illness. The extreme isolation of mountain life, which many people tolerated or even preferred, proved too stressful for someone with underlying psychological vulnerabilities. The feedback loop between paranoid thoughts and actual isolation created a situation where symptoms reinforced themselves until intervention became impossible. The story of Silas Rigsby serves as a reminder of how quickly the human mind can transform familiar environments into landscapes of terror. The mountains that had provided him with 40 years of peaceful existence became, in his troubled perception, a theater of constant threat and surveillance. The solitude that he had once chosen freely became a prison from which escape required abandoning everything he had built during 4 decades of mountain life. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that Silas's descent into paranoia began with genuine observations about his environment. The sounds of wildlife, the patterns of weather, the subtle changes in forest conditions that every mountain dweller learns to recognize became, in his mind, evidence of human threats that existed only in his imagination. The very skills that had allowed him to survive successfully in the wilderness for so long were turned against him by his deteriorating mental state. The case also raises questions about the nature of reality itself and how individual perception shapes our understanding of the world around us. For Silas, the threats he perceived were absolutely real, supported by evidence that seemed convincing within his distorted framework of interpretation. His actions were logical responses to the situation as he understood it, even though that understanding was fundamentally flawed. The final tragedy of Silas Rigsby lies not simply in his disappearance or presumed death, but in the loss of a man who had successfully lived for decades as part of the mountain community, contributing his skills and knowledge to the shared survival that characterized frontier life. His transformation from valued neighbor to isolated fugitive illustrates how mental illness can destroy not just individual lives, but the social connections that give meaning to human existence. In the end, the case of Silas Rigsby remains a testament to both the fragility of the human mind and the power of fear to reshape reality. The mountains of West Virginia, which had sheltered him for most of his adult life, witnessed his transformation from peaceful homesteader to paranoid wanderer. The hollow that bore his name returned to wilderness, leaving only scattered evidence of the tragedy that unfolded there during the final months of the 19th century. Today, hikers occasionally discover remnants of the geometric patterns that Silas created behind his cabin. The paths he wore into the earth, though overgrown, remain visible to those who know where to look. These traces serve as a physical reminder of one man's descent into madness and the terrible logic of fear that drove him from everything he had known and loved. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, the question remains, did Silas Rigsby find the peace that eluded him during his final months in Rigsby Hollow? Or did he carry his invisible pursuers with him until the end, never realizing that the most relentless enemy was the one that lived within his own mind?